velkomin í varðveislu og rannsóknarsetur Þjóðminjasafnsins í Hafnarfirði. Við ætlum að vera með smá svona beina útsendingu hérna í dag. Við ætlum að skoða eina beinagrind og fjöldan allan af fleiri beinum úr mönnum. Í þessu húsi varðveitum við bæði mannabein og dýrabein og gripi sem eru ekki á sýningum. Ég heiti Hrönn, ég fornleifafræðingur. Þetta hérna Joe og hann mannabeinafræðingur og hann ætlar svona að segja okkur frá beinunum. Endilega setja inn spurningar og við reynum að svara bara strax og við sjáum þær. Joe, til þín.
So, shall we begin with a question or begin with an overview of the skeleton?
Just an overview of the skeleton, maybe.
So this individual comes from Hafjallarey, which is an island off of the coast of Snæfellsnes Peninsula, and he lived sometime between 16th, 17th century, like most likely.
16. 17. aldar maður, kallmaður, frá Hafjallarey.
He was approximately 35 to 45 at the time of death, which we can tell from a number of different degenerative changes which occur in the skeleton as one grows older. For example, we use specific traits in the os coxae, or the pelvis.
Mjaðmagrindinni.
Yeah.
Þetta mjaðmagrindin þarna og svo
Einmitt.
hryggsúlan. Var það ekki?
Yeah. And we also use degenerative changes or attrition, also known as wear, of the teeth to determine age in adult individuals. When someone is a bit younger, we can actually use the developmental stages of the teeth in order to identify childhood age at death. When people grow a bit older, it becomes a lot more difficult to precisely determine age. And that's just because there's so much variation between people and between their activities, genetics, and their lifestyle, and overall health as well. In some cases, you will find people known to be 70, 80, 90 years old, but still look to be skeletally in their 40s or 50s, and the opposite is also true.
Hann var mjög slæmu ástandi, líkamlega, ekki satt.
He was in a very poor condition at the time of death, judging by the extent of osteoarthritis that can be seen throughout the skeleton. He also experienced numerous fractures during his lifetime, some of which healed and others of which were actively healing at the time of death. For example, at some point he attained a nasal fracture, which has healed with only a slight apposition, meaning a slight angulation from the normal bone, the normal morphology of the bone. Likewise, he suffered from a few different rib fractures. For example, he fractured the same rib on both sides around the same time. They were in a similar state of healing, or in a state of the formation of a pseudoarthrosis, meaning a false joint which is formed between the two ends of the fracture points. In another example, we have a fractured rib, which has actually undergone quite a lot of advanced healing. As you can see, there is still a bone callus, meaning that there is a swollen part in the bone itself. However, it is completely healed and maintained more or less its original shape.
Við fengum eina spurningu hvort það væri hægt að snúa vélinni það ekki hægt að því að þá komum við bara á hlið í mynd. Ég veit ekki alveg af hverju það gerist, en við verðum bara að hafa þetta svona eins og Svo höfum við fengið spurningu tennur.
Tennur.
Áður.
Já.
Hvernig var tannheilsa landnámsfólks?
In the Viking Age, dental health was, you could say, not as bad as in many other places. There was quite a lot of dental calculus, known as tandstein, and there was also quite a lot of periodontal disease, but carious lesions were very uncommon until probably about the 18th century, when the import of sugar became more common. A lot of other lifestyle changes were also happening at that time, which may have contributed to the poor dental health seen in later times. For example, in a review that I've conducted of the collection, approximately only 1% of teeth have carious lesions. This person, for example, has 2 carious lesions. They were alive probably around the 18th century, which would explain why we see carious lesions in this individual.
Já, þannig að holur í tönnum voru ekkert fyrir en seinna. Við fengum ekkert hérna.
However, people, even in the Viking Age, they were not necessarily immune to other types of dental infection, unlike carious lesions. For example, you can see here this person from Hafjadre has a quite large dental abscess or periapical lesion. This has probably caused the tooth to fall out and has caused significant resorption of the alveolar bone or the periodontal bone.
Þess að einhver svona sýking í tannholdinu sem gerir þetta.
Einmitt. And we also have some sign of healing. The margins at the uppermost extremity, at the superior portion, have begun to round and smoothen, indicating that a period of healing has occurred between the person's infection and the time of death. The short answer is essentially that people in the Viking period tended to have a lot of dental calculus and sometimes dental infections, but the people more closer to us in time tend to have more carious lesions and did not necessarily decrease in any of the other dental changes. One of these reasons is that people were not using toothbrushes until about the 19th century. However, the use of toothpicks probably began as early as the Viking period, and that probably did help with dental health to some degree. Carrying on with this person, we also have this oblique or spiral fracture of the tibia and fibula. These probably happened at the same time, and as you can see, there is the fracture has actually caused the bone to shorten by 1 or 1.5 centimeters. However, the bone healed extremely well, despite some slight apposition that can be seen here. The fracture lines in the radiograph show at the point at which the fracture actually occurred. When this is taken in consideration with the extensive osteoarthritic changes to the hip and the femoral head, we can definitely conclude that this person experienced some mobility complications, such as a limp, for example. The extent of osteoarthritis can be seen by the shininess of the joint surfaces. So this person had such advanced arthritis that the soft tissues have been worn away, the connecting tissues between the joints, and this has caused bone on bone to polish, and that is why it becomes porous, shiny, and smooth. This is known as hibernation.
Þetta alveg skelfilegt dæmi liðagigt. Mjög slæmt. Við fengum eina spurningu.
Okay.
Hvernig getum við séð hvaða kyni einstaklingurinn er?
Yeah. So to determine the sex of an individual, we use various morphological traits. So, for example, the most basic is size. Men tend to be larger than women. However, as we know, some men are quite short and gracile, and some women may be tall and more robust. So size is not enough to determine someone's sex, but sometimes size and metrical measurements can be used to give us a better indication that go along with the morphological identifications that we make from the shape of the bones. So, for example, you have the femoral head. In men, this measures greater than 48. In this case, we have a femoral head of 52 millimeters. And in women...
Mjálmakúlan.
Yeah.
Já.
And in women...
Mjálmakúlunar sem skiptir máli.
Yes, exactly. And in women, it tends to be smaller, usually less than 43 millimeters, with this one being 40 millimeters. So as you can see, there is this range in between 43 and 48. So if we find a measurement in between that range, then we cannot say anything more than that it's an indeterminate sex estimation. We have a similar measurement pattern with the humerus, the upper arm.
Það upphandlegsbein og svo lærleggurinn sem notaður til að greina kyn, aðalega.
Furthermore, we have the more important identifiers of sex, which are morphological traits. So these are essentially the shape of the skeletal remains. So in this example, you can see that there's a quite narrow sciatic notch, this being the sciatic notch, and this one has a wider sciatic notch.
Hlutir af mjálmagrindinni.
Yes. Here, you do not see a groove underneath the auricular surface. However, on this one, you see this groove underneath the auricular surface. These two traits indicate that this is a female and that this is a male.
Notar margar aðferðir í rauninni.
Yeah.
Mjálmagrindina og beinin, lærlegg og upphandlegsbein.
Exactly. The whole aim is to use as many different methods to answer the question as possible. And the more methods, the more skeletal elements you can measure or analyze, the more accurate estimations we can make. For another example, we have the mandible, or the jaw. In men, you tend to have a much wider ramus of the mandible than in women. Similarly, you have a broader and flatter chin or mentum. Women tend to have a more pointed chin or mentum. Likewise, in the skull, women tend to have sharper orbital rims and bossing towards the back of the head, as well as more gracile features, for example at the mastoid or the post-zygomatic arch. Whereas men tend to have more robust features, such as a large mastoid and a large post-zygomatic arch, or the large muscle attachment seen here, the nuchal crest, or the external occipital protuberance, to be very scientific.
Ég þekki ekki íslenska þýðingu á því, ég get ekki sagt það. En sem sagt bara hauskúpan minni og ennið flatara hjá konum, var það ekki? Og svo einhver munur á hauskúpunum sem ég get ekki lýst. Sem ég skil ekki sem bara fornleifafræðingur. Við fengum aðra spurningu það sem við vorum að tala áðan með brotna legginn. Eru ummerki að fóturinn hafi verið réttur af eftir að hafa brotnað? Það verið eitthvað gert við hann eða hefur hann bara gróið saman eins og hann brotnaði?
Right. It's difficult to say. However, since there is very little apposition and actually no misalignment, as you can see in the radiograph, the two segments or the two halves are pretty well aligned, but there is a bit of apposition on the sides. It's possible that someone bound the leg in order to straighten it and try to provide stability. Obviously, since it did heal so well, they were not using the leg for some period of time, and there would have been a period in which they probably needed to either have it bound or immobilized in order for it to heal to the degree and quality that it has healed.
It's not the same sort of pulling that they do now?
No, I would not say so. That generally is done with femoral fractures, which usually occur with high force impacts, such as a motor vehicle accident. In the past, it was quite uncommon to break the femora. However, we do have one really interesting example, which is, I would say, quite rare in historical or archaeological skeletal remains, which is this individual who is represented only by these three bones. What's quite remarkable is that if this is indeed the tibia associated with these femoral bones, why did the tibia not fracture when the femoral bones fractured?
Sem sagt, það voru lærleggirnir sem brotnuðu en ekki fótleggurinn sjálfur.
Exactly.
Þannig að þetta eru bæði brot á lærlegg á sömu manneskjunni.
Right. Assuming that this bone does indeed belong to this person. We don't know a whole lot about the context of the excavation or of the individual. However, each bone is broken in at least one place, and there was degrees of infection, probably with some draining from the inside of the bone, the draining of pus or infectious material.
Svona lækningar aðferð að hreinsa eða bara gerist þetta sjálft?
This would have just been something that someone had to take care of this person for them to survive. They definitely would not be able to use their legs immediately following the fractures, and seeing that they have healed so well, they are quite misaligned, but they have completely healed. They are healed before the person died, which means that they survived with this for quite a long time, definitely months, maybe years, which means that someone in their society was indeed taking care of them in order to survive long enough for such severe fractures to heal. These type of femoral fractures, especially in the past, and if they had any type of surface break out of the skin, they quickly lead to infection and before the time of antibiotics, blood infection from something like a femoral fracture is often, or was often, lethal.
Já, einmitt. Það hefur samt komið sýking í
Yes, yeah.
Það hefur verið klippt út gröftrænum.
Yeah, so when the pressure of the infection, of the pus or the infectious material becomes so great, it will usually find a way out. So then it penetrates through the bone, thereby releasing the pus from the bone, and it will often find its way through the skin as well.
Og kannski bjargaði manneskinu frá því að fá blóðeitrun að hreinsa þetta út.
Right.
Það einhverju fleiri spurningar. Hægt að lesa út úr beinunum hvers konar lífi einstaklingurinn hefur lifað? Hvort hann hafi borðað nóg, verið við góða heilsu?
Yes, there are some indications that we can glean from the skeletal remains about diet and nutrition. For example, in this individual, we have a condition called parodic hyperostosis. This is a pathological change which occurs, it's believed to occur due to something like iron deficiency, for example.
Járnskortur eða vítamínskortur.
Yes, yeah. However, the reason that it occurs is a bit ambiguous, and some people have actually suggested that it's a better indication of adaptation to your environment than it is of malnutrition. But similarly, we have this parietal bone fragment, and here is another normal parietal bone. As you can see, the diplo, the actual cranial bone, is much thicker than this normal cranial bone. And that can occur from anemia, for example, or from other diseases like Paget's disease.
Þetta svona höfuðkúpubein úr höfuðkúpunni sjálfri.
Yeah. One other example is in this infant's remains. This is a child, probably a newborn, who has this new soft, porous, new woven bone formation. Unfortunately, it's difficult to tell with non-adult remains because while this could be an indication of an infection, such as scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency, it could also just be an indication of normal growth because children's bones are growing so fast that they need to deposit bone very quickly. And so sometimes the pathological bone is difficult to tell apart from normal bone, from normal developmental bone.
Þetta gæti verið skýrbjúgur, en þetta gæti líka verið bara venjulegt þroskun í beinið að þroskast sem lítið barn.
There are other indicators about nutrition. For example, it's a bit difficult to see in this example because there's so much dental calculus. But if you can see, there are a few lines here in the front of the teeth. This is called dental enamel hypoplasia. This is something that occurs during childhood when the teeth are developing. It occurs if you are, for example, undergoing a period of stress, severe illness, or extreme malnutrition. And the lines, the hypoplastic lines develop in the teeth. They actually represent specific instances of individual stress in childhood.
Það getur verið bara næringarskortur eða eitthvað slíkt í barnæsku sem veldur þessum línum í tönnunum.
Another way that we investigate diet is through the use of stable isotope analysis. So in order to do that, we normally take a bone sample, or for example, in this case, a tooth has been sampled. So the researcher sectioned the tooth in half. This is a maxillary molar. And the tooth was used both to carbon date the individual and to find out what their diet primarily consisted of. Being from Hafjadare, most of the people there were fishermen and there were some farmers, and they relied heavily on a marine diet, which the isotopes did in fact indicate as well. This tooth, the glærungur, the dental enamel of the tooth, was also used, I believe, yes, it was used to determine the geographic provenance of the person, meaning where they were born, and it turns out that they were actually born here in Iceland.
Getur sagt til hvort fólk hefur flust inn til landsins eða hvort það sé fætt á staðnum.
So basically, if the ratio of, for example, strontium in this case, if the ratio of strontium is above 0.7092, then you have somebody who is not from Iceland. However, this person was.
Það einhver dæmi það hér á landi að fólk hafi séð frá öðrum löndum og við sjáum það á tönnunum.
Yes, yeah. Most of the individuals which have been identified as being foreign actually come from the settlement period, and as time increases, there are a lot less foreigners identified in the archaeological assemblages. For example, none at Hafjadare or at Skriðuklaustur.
Það kannski meira úr fólk sem finnst í kumlum sem þá að koma frá öðrum löndum.
During the Viking period and as they were settling the country. What is interesting though is that you have you basically have these groups of people coming together, and from both the isotopes and the DNA we see that people were mixing before they came to Iceland and after. On this person we also have the evidence of a bone sample which was taken with a boar, and this sample was taken at some point in the past, likely for carbon dating.
En það hefur verið tekið sýni úr þessu, þetta ekki náttúrulegt á beininu.
Nei.
Heldur var tekið sýni af beininu til að greina já, líklega aldursgreiningu.
Isotope greining. And in this individual, however, this is usually not the type of sample that we like to permit or take, because as you can see it leaves quite an obvious mark on the bone and does change its overall appearance. It's quite often that you have fragments of ribs, for example. They tend to fracture in the burial environment anyway, and they can often be used to answer the same questions as you might get from a tibial fracture or from a tibial sample.
Þessi hérna frá Hafjadare, hann hefur verið grafinn upp á 1954.
The 45.
45.
Yeah. Yes, it was excavated by Jón Stephenson and was it Mattias Þórðarson in 1945. Because the site itself was actually eroding into the sea, and so it needed to be done almost as a rescue excavation. In the early 20th century, 12 scientists came to Iceland and collected quite many skulls from Hafjadare. This is quite unfortunate because those skulls are now abroad, and the postcranial remains are stored here.
Þess að hauskúpurnar eru annar staðar en við erum með restina af beinunum á sumum af þessum beinagrindum frá Hafjarðari.
So ideally, the museum currently keeping these skeletal remains, the skulls of the individuals curated here, to act in the most ethical way, they really should return them.
Restina af beinunum, þessar hauskúpur eru frá Útskálum á Reykjanesinu, fundust við breytingar á kirkjunni. Það voru undir gólfi kirkjunar þessar og voru bara í einhverju svona hrúgu og við vitum ekkert mikið meira þær. Þær eru fyrir 1800 líklega. Og bæði konur, menn og börn. Og líklega þau bara hafa verið teknar úr kirkjugarðinum þegar verið að stækka kirkjuna og bara setta þarna undir eins og gerist nú oft. Bara hrúa þarna undir.
Something else of interest is this extremely large example of Taurus palatinus.
Já.
Gómgarður.
Gómgarður á íslensku.
It's an anatomical trait or an anatomical variation known as non-metric traits in anthropology. It is not pathological, but when they are large enough, they can, in some cases, cause some difficulties with maneuvering of the tongue, or with swallowing, or even speech. What's interesting about Taurus palatinus, or gómgarður, is in fact that it's very common in Iceland. It's not as common as Taurus mandibularis, which can be seen here in a less extreme expression. But what is interesting about these two traits is that they are the most common in the world in Icelanders, Norwegians, and the Inuit. Obviously, the Norwegians and Icelanders are related, but they are not related to the Inuit. So this shows that there is something more than a simple genetic correlation going on. There must also be some environmental factor or some other type of activity stress which activates or increases the expression of these traits.
Það er mjög íslenskt að vera með svona annarkvort í efri gómi eða neðri góm.
You could say that.
Svona, já.
In fact, up to 50% of Icelanders today have Taurus mandibularis. I believe it's about 30% for Taurus palatinus.
Þannig að endilega tjekkið hvort þið séu með svona.
Going back to age estimation, as I discussed before, in adults we use degenerative changes and a rate of attrition in the teeth. But in non-adults we use development instead. So with non-adults we can actually determine age based upon the degree of dental eruption. So as a child grows older, of course, their baby teeth erupt, the baby teeth are then pushed out by the permanent teeth. And each of these teeth that erupt correlate with a pretty specific time period, within a few years anyways.
Mjög auðvelt að sjá aldur barna á þessum tönnum sem að koma upp eða ekki búin að koma upp.
Right. Much easier to determine age in children than in adults, for example. This person, for example, was probably 10 to 12 years of age at the time of death, based upon the rate of eruption and the retention of the first molar, non-permanent molar, or deciduous molar. Whereas this individual has not had any permanent dental eruption yet, and is in the beginning stages only of the non-adult dental eruption, which would indicate that this person died probably before the age of 6 months.
Með eina áhugaverða spurningu viðbót. Geta smitandi sjúkdómar haft áhrif á bein?
Yes, definitely. And
Það ekki svolítið eftir því hvaða sjúkdómar það eru, eða?
some types of pathological changes or diseases will cause destructive change, others cause proliferative change or bone growth, others cause porosity, but bone reacts in very few ways. There are only a few different ways that it expresses itself in reaction to some type of stimulus.
Það eru, ef ég skil þetta rétt, þá annarkvort getur vaxið út frá beinunum, það getur komið göt í beinin, eða, hvað var það þriðja aftur?
Growth of new bone, destruction of bone.
Já, það eyðist af beininu, eða það komur svona göt, svona, er það með eitthvað svoleiðis? Það komur svona lítil göt í beinin.
So as you can see, they have these smooth, rounded edges, which indicate that it isn't something that was just punctured in the grave, but rather something that they had at the time they were alive. If the bone had been just broken post-mortem, then you would see some of these changes that you see on the edges here, this very fragile, friable bone with a lightened color in the edge.
Þannig að sérð munina á því þegar fornleifafræðingarnir skemma beinin þegar að grafa þau upp, eða þegar þetta bara náttúru, eða sem sagt, þetta hefur gerst á meðan maðurinn var á lífi.
Yeah, so it can be quite difficult to determine or to actually notice pathological changes before the bones have been properly cleaned and rearticulated. It's similar to how it's quite common that you don't end up with the hand or foot bones, and it's not because anyone is taking them away or not burying them in the first place, but usually just because they often, especially when they are covered in mud, look like small stones, so they just don't get excavated all the time.
En aftur að sjúkdómunum, hvaða sjúkdómar getur verið sem sjást á beinunum?
So there are certain diseases which show very explicit marks on bone. For example, treponemal disease like syphilis, venereal syphilis. This causes extreme destructive changes called kerisica to the frontal bone or the forehead. But it also causes destructive lesions throughout the remaining bones. One typical sign of syphilis is called saber shin, which is when new bone formation forms on the periosteal surface. So the bone actually begins to take a curved appearance because of all the layers of new bone developing on the surface. Otherwise, we can also tell quite often if someone has tuberculosis, should the spine be preserved. With the spine and tuberculosis, you get Pott's disease, which is an extreme scoliosis which will occur usually somewhere around the middle of the back, causing the upper part of the back to curve substantially. With that, you also get lesions on the visceral surfaces of the ribs, which forms in small nodules or bumps of new bone. These can be evidence of a respiratory infection, so something that causes a lot of coughing, such as tuberculosis. Berklar, yeah. Another very specific disease that we can often identify in skeletal remains is leprosy, holdsveiki. This causes extreme changes to the facial bones, such as the destruction of the nasals and the upper or the proximal or superior part of the palatine, the upper jaw. But it also causes destruction to the extremities of the body. So you'll find that the fingers begin to lose or destroy bits of bone, which creates a penciled or pointed type shape to the bones that have been affected. Unfortunately, we don't have any examples of leprosy in Iceland, though the disease was here.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, I don't have anything to show regarding leprosy, but it's probably fortunate that there are no cases. Tuberculosis. Unfortunately, this is one we cannot see on the bones. However, there are some archaeological methods people use to determine if someone is coming from a Black Death pit. However, that's not something that would apply here in Iceland. However, it has worked in England before, where they've been able to identify Black Death graveyards or cemeteries, or mass burials even. If we want to find out whether someone was infected with the Black Death, then we actually need to take bone samples and subject them to ancient DNA analysis, which, if the preservation is good enough and the person was indeed infected, then there is the possibility that you could identify the bacterial or the pathogenic DNA of Yersinia pestis, which is what caused the Black Death, or is what is believed to have caused the Black Death. Right.
Við fengum fleiri spurningar. Þessar á ensku. How many samples would usually be taken to determine the various estimates, like age of the person, the time period, and so on?
Right. So today we would only take one sample. With one good sample, you should be able to do multiple isotope analysis, ancient DNA, and C14 dating.
And it's mostly the teeth.
The teeth are really...
if it's possible, if you have the teeth.
Yeah, if it's possible, it depends what you want to analyze. If you want DNA, then you need to analyze it from the tooth. You can analyze it from anywhere, but your sample will not necessarily be very good. From the teeth, or from the petrous portion of the skull, you can actually cut this part of the skull bone here, and you take part of the auditory meatus. So it's a very dense part of the petrous portion. It's a very dense part of the temporal bone. That is a suitable DNA sample along with the teeth. And lastly, recently discovered is that the auditory ossicles are also really good DNA reservoirs. These are the small... yeah.
Undir augunum. Við erum bara búið með tíman hjá okkur.
One last interesting thing before we leave to pay attention to is the green staining that you can see through the spine and on some of the ribs. This is copper alloy staining, and what it implies is that there was some type of copper, iron, or alloy object in the burial with this person. What that might have been, I cannot say.
Eina sem eftir bara þessir blettir á beinagrindinni.
Yeah.
Ekkert hefur fundist, engin greipur. Og einhverjar fleiri spurningar? Nei? Ég held að við verðum bara...
What do you mean by the bone being friable? So the bone becomes, I don't mean friable as in set it in a frying pan, I mean friable as in fragile or flaky. It becomes desiccated, dried out, and prone to fracture. This type of bone has lost its integrity because it's been broken. And as you can see, the trabecular bone, or the bone on the inside, is also quite poorly preserved. But this actually has been consolidated. So in the past, in the 40s and 50s, it was common for anthropologists and conservators to apply various consolidants, adhesives, or other types of materials in order to stabilize the bone. So this is not as fragile as it could have been had conservation not occurred. Yeah. For example, at one point, here we have another rib fracture. This is something that I would never recommend anyone do today, which is that they've actually glued the rib fracture back together, defeating the entire ability to analyze the fracture itself. And even when this type of bone, which has been glued back together, is subjected to radiography, we end up with a white, opaque area that obscures the fracture altogether. So this is not a practice that we carry on with anymore, but it does have its applications in teaching. As you can see, all these bones are marked, meaning that it would be very difficult for these remains to end up mixed with another individual. However, they also obscure anatomical landmarks and pathological changes, as well as just questions about the ethical practice of writing on human remains.
Herra, við segjum bara bless.
Thank
Takk fyrir
you.
okkur. Takk fyrir að fylgjast með.